we're going to be looking at the Python function. Now, what is a Python function? So, a Python function is a block of reusable code designed to perform a specific task. So, functions help make your code modular, organized, and easier to read and maintain. Now, why use Python function? So, Python function allows us to reuse code as write a piece of logic once and use it multiple times. Then number two, it helps us to organize code, which is break down complex problems into smaller and manageable parts. Then number three is to improve readability. So the function describes what the code does, making it more understandable, right? So we need to know how to define function in Python. So we have a reserved word called a def keyword, right? So this function uses these def keywords, right? So followed by the function name and the parenthesis. This is the parenthesis, right? So now this is an example of a function where we have the def, then the function name, and then this return result, which is optional, and then the function body, which is the algorithm we need to write within this function here, right? So you can see that the function name is the name of the function, then the parameter, which is optional, which inputs values that the function can accept. Then the return is optional, the value the function gives back as a result. So this is optional, right? So I'm going to show you guys why this is optional. But first, we need to understand the naming convention, how we can be able to define a function. So number one is the lowercase. So function name should be in lowercase. It's not like a must that it must be lowercase, but most times it's good to put a name or the function name as a lowercase, right? Which is called the snake case. I will call it a snake case. So we use underscore to separate words for better readability, something like this. So let's assume that I want to write a function called I want to write a function to add two numbers together, right? So I can say add number. So if I do something like this, right? Although this is not like it's not for it doesn't aid for better readability. All you just need to do is to use underscore here, which gives you what add number, which shows the name, like a good name. It is a verb name, add number, add. Right? Add is a verb, it shows the verb name to actually when somebody sees this name, it knows that okay, this function is trying to add numbers right together. So that's what it does, followed by parentheses like this and with the column and then click. So you have to be very careful with your indentation, right? You can see when I click enter, you can see where it took me to, right? So you have to be careful with your indentation. So let's assume that we have a function called add number and we have a variable called a. So a is assigned as 3 and let's say b, a variable called b which is assigned as 4, right? So you can put the return here which is optional. So I'm trying to return a plus b, which I will explain what it does. But first, we need to understand the naming convention of Python function, right? So let's move forward. So number two is start with a letter or underscore, right? So a function name must start with a letter, right? It's a letter like this or an underscore like this. So it cannot start with a number. Remember, a function cannot start with a number. So there are other rules. There are no special character or spaces. So function name cannot contain special characters like this. So these are special characters like or spaces, right? So avoid starting with underscore unless necessary. You can see the look at it. So single underscore indicates a private or internal function by convention, right? Then double underscore invoke name mangling, which makes it function name harder to access directly. So this is usually for internal use case in classes which you're going to be learning as time moves as we move on in this class, right? In this computer programming one. So now, what are the rules? We see now the function needs to be descriptive, right? So the function name should clearly describe what the function does, right? So this enables other people, other users to understand what the function is actually doing, right? So avoid difficult or single letter names unless they have a clear purpose. So you can see this one, this main one, the main way of defining function to use verbs in function name. So we know that verbs are action words, right? So any name you want to give your function should be like an action word. So you use verb or action words to indicate what the function performs. You can see what we did here. So this function is actually trying to add numbers and this function name called add number, right? So the last one is we shouldn't use reserved words to name our function. So avoid reserved keywords, right? So do not use Python reserved keywords or built-in function name as your function name, right? So these are built-in function name like the print, the learn, the return and the for, which we're going to be using in our classes as we move on in this computer programming one, right? So these are just the normal rules you need to understand when naming a function, right? These are normal rules when naming a function. So the next one we'll look at is parameter argument. So before we look at that, let's define our function without a parameter. Now this is a function without a parameter, right? So we have a function called add number, right? A function called add number, and the add number has two variables. Now the first one is holding 3 or is assigned as 3, and the second one is holding 4 or is assigned as 4. So now we're returning a plus b, right? So this is a simple function. So now I will go out of this function. Now you can see where my point is taking me to out of this function, right? Out. So but if you declare a as this, it means that a is not within this function here, and you can see the error, right? Yeah, you can see what happens, right? So you have to be very careful with your indentation. Now out of this function now, all right, print. I'll call the function add number. So this function is without a parameter, so I'll just put add number and then a parenthesis. So when I run this, so this script is app.py script. So when I run py app.py, it gives me what 7, because it's returning 3 plus 4, which gives you 7. Now when I say this is optional, right, I can decide to use print here. Print a plus b. Remember that print is a function. What the print does, print is an inbuilt function that returns a result. So what this print does is we have the print, which is the inbuilt function here, right? Which is already built in this Python here. So what this print does is we'll call the print function and we'll pass in this argument a plus b here within here, right? So this print function can take any data type, right? You can print in any data type. So when we say print a plus b, what we're trying to do is the same way we're doing for return. So the same way we do for print. So it means that we're printing 3 plus 4, right? So when you do this, at this point here, you won't do print. We can actually call the function directly without using print here, like this, right? So I will call the function here. It prints out. It's to give us 7, right? To give us 7. You can see what happens, right? So that is how to define functions. So the next thing we need to learn here is parameter and argument. Now the reason for learning parameters and argument is you can see that this function here will statically define a local variable within this function here, and we can't actually change this number, right? We can when you're using this function, right? If I want to reuse this function, you can see what happens. I can't actually change this number. Look at when I reuse this function here, I can't actually change this number. Alright, so I have to go back to the function and then change the number, which actually is not a good idea. Let me give another instance, right? So I've defined a function here like this. Let's create another script call. Let me create another script called test.py. Right? Assuming I want to use this function in this test.py here, all I just need to do is to import the script, which I will say from app, which is the name of the script here, where the function is written, then import the add number. Right? So I've from app, which means I'm calling this script called app, right? So I'm importing this function written inside this app here in this test.py. Or even if you don't want to do this, you can use a star symbol to import everything written in this app.py. But right now we only have one function written in here. One function written in here. So let's assume that I want to use it here, right? So all I just need to do is to write add number here, and then the followed by the parentheses. So if I'm to call this now, instead of calling this, because this will not run, because it will not run anymore, because I didn't call this function here outside this function. I didn't call it. So all I did, I call it in the test.py here. So now I'm running the test.py, which gives me 7, right? So you can see that this function didn't actually give me room to put in other numbers for me to see what happens, right? So because the variables are locally defined and the numbers are statically passed within this function here. So now that is where the parameter comes into play. So now what is a parameter? Now a parameters are variables declared in function definition. A parameters are variables declared in function definition. So if you go to our function here, so instead of having statically defined 3 and 4, I will just remove this now. So I'll put it as a parameter within the parentheses here, which is a and b. So this becomes a parameter within this function definition. So parameters are variables declared within a function definition. So it gives me room now. So when I come to the test of pi, right? So we have two parameters now. So we're now passing the arguments here. So now what is an argument? So you can see arguments are values passed to the function when calling it. So when we are calling this function, we have called this function here and we have two parameters passed in here. Right, so that means we have to pass in two arguments. Let's say we have 4 and then we have 5. So if I'm to print this will give me 9, right? So even if I have 400 and even if I have 598, it will still give me the same thing, 998. You can see the advantage of parameters, right? So it gives you room to flexibly key in your values and then does this. We follow up the algorithm written here and does the addition for us, right? Because this function is to add two numbers together. So that is the advantage of this parameter. So we need to learn the type of parameter. So the type of parameter is, well, understood what argument is. So we need to understand the types of parameters. So type of parameter, the first one we have is the positional parameter. So the positional parameter is the order of argument matters, right? The order of argument matters. So what we just did now is you can see the order of argument matters where we have the function called grade. And we have two variables which are the parameters, which is name and age, right? So you can see that Alice is assigned, name is assigned as Alice, and age is assigned as 25. So this is called positional argument, right? Let's say something like this. We have already done it. So this is called actually called a positional argument. So let's say we have a function called greet like this, right? And we have the name and the age as a variable. These are the parameters, right? So if I click enter, let's say I'm printing. So this is a string. So I'm trying to return a string, right? So I'm printing name, then I'm printing age. So let me tell you guys something that you need to understand here. Now you can see that this print is an inbuilt function, and you can see this inbuilt function is returning a string, right? But now what this inbuilt function will return is supposed to return name and age, right? But if there is no format here, right, it will not return this, rather it will return this as a string. Because let's do this, let's test it as C. Now we have another function called greet, right? So let's say in this test here, right? So I've called the greet here. Remember the star sign enables me to see all the functions written in the app.py because we have imported from app import all of the function written in this app.py here. So I have greet and this greet has two parameters. So I'm passing the arguments here, which the first one is, let's call this John Wendy, right? And let's call the other one 68, 67, right? So if I run this, right, you can see what happens, right? So ignore this first result. Remember, this first result is on 998. So the second one is returning name and age. Now it's returning name and age because we are telling it to return the string, right? But you need to use the word called format, which is F. Now F allows us to pass in the values, right? There you can see what happens, right? It allows us to pass in the values within the string, right? Pass in these parameters within the string here. So if I run this again, it gives me Joendi and 67, right? So which I can say here that my name is this and I am this years old. So if I run this again, you can see my name is Joendi and I am 67 years old. So if I change this to 102 years, so my name is John Wendy and I'm 102 years old. So you can see what happens, right? So dynamically, this format here enables the interpreter to be able to pass in this um, variable here within the string and also pass in this variable age within the string here. Now you can see what happens, right? So this is what we call the positional argument. So let's look for the positional parameter. So let's look for the next one, which is default parameter. So these provide default values for parameters. Like this is default value where you pass in the age here, right? So you just pass in the age here. So when you print hello, this name, then you are these years old, right? So now instead of passing, okay, let's do it. Let's do the example here. So let's write another function now, which we want to explain this positioner, the default parameter. Now the default parameter is, now I have this grid finds name. So within this parameter here, I can decide to pass in a value called 56 here, right? So let me put, because we're not supposed to have the same function name, right? Grid name. So let me put this right now. When calling this function now, let's call this one. Let's call grid name. Now we have a default one, which is age equals to 56. Now there's no need of calling the age anymore. So all I just need to do is let's put let's use Philip. So if I'm to run this, right? So you can see what happens, right? So my name is, you can see instead of passing two arguments, we are only passing one, because by default we are already passing a value to age, right? So if I pass in value here, let's put John Scope here. So if I come here, let's try to run this and see if it will run, right? So you can see that the the Greek name actually still run this Philip for us. But even if I remove this, right, by default, even if I remove this, it will still run. The reason for this running is that I've already passed in my argument when I'm trying to declare, but I will declare my parameters here, so it will still run without the arguments. You can see what happens, right? You can see what happens. So when I'm calling, it looks like there's no argument here. Well, because by default, I've already passing the argument when defining our parameters here, right? That's what happens here. That's what we call the default. So just take note of this, right? Please take note of this, very important. Take note of this and also take note of this. Now let's look at the other ones. So we understood what positional parameter is, we have understood what default parameter is. Now the next one we'll look at here is a keyword argument. Now the keyword argument specify arguments by name, making the order irrelevant, right? Making the order irrelevant. So now this keyword argument, what it does is, remember that by default we need to follow the order like this. But if you don't want to follow the order like this, what you just need to do is, now if you come to this test here, now looking at this grade function, this function name called grade, we have the name and age. I can decide to swap that right here. So in this grade here, I can decide to have, oh god, I can decide to have my age here equals to like 56 here. Then I can decide to have the name equal to my car. Alright, so if I'm run this, you can see what happens. My name is Michael, I'm 56 years old. So you can see we have swapped we can see what we did here. We swapped it, right? It still work fine, right? So that's what we call the keyword argument. But make sure that but at the same time it still work like this, right? But we swapped it here, which works like this. So this is what we call the keyword argument, right? Please take note of the keyword argument, take note of the position argument, and take note of the default argument, right? So you can see that this one actually have parameters. Well, we have defined the arguments when we are defining the function. We are passing the arguments, the values when we define the function. That's why if we are calling it, we can call it like this with a single parenthesis here, right? So this keyword argument allows us to swap the the parameters, right, and pass an argument to it, and it still works fine, right? So please just understand these steps. So the next one we're going to be looking at is a variable length argument. Now, this is a way to define a variable length argument in Python, which allows passing a variable number of position arguments, right? A variable number of position arguments. So now let's assume that we have, although I will not go into detail with these because we have not learned loops yet, right? We have not learned loop here. When we learn loop, I'm going to be explaining this, and then the keyword argument also, I'm going to be explaining this, which allows passing a variable number of keyword arguments. I'm going to be explaining this when we look at loop. right? So next video we're going to be looking at conditional ifs, and if there's time we'll look at the loops where we're trying to look at this keyword argument. This is called the keyword arguments, allowing to pass in the keyword arguments, and this is also called the arguments, right? Allowing passing variable numbers or position arguments. We're going to learn this. Right. So all you just need to do is to understand these keyword arguments by name making the order irrelevant, right? To understand the default parameter, to understand the positional parameters, right? The positional parameter, default parameter, and then the keyword argument. That is what you just need to understand here in this lesson 3 Python function. So now let's look at returning values, right? So a function can return a value using the return statement, which I've shown you guys, right? And the function can also return multiple values, right? It can also return multiple values like this. So let me give an instance like this. Let's give an instance. So let's assume that we already have a function here. We already have a function here, which is this, which this is returning a single value. So what if we want this to return multiple value? Right? Remember we're using print. So now I want to use return. Remember I've already used return here. I want to use return a plus b and then a minus b. Return a plus b and a minus b. Add none. Let me use add subtract numbers, right? So this is a function which returns 2 like this, right? Now if I want to call this function now, all I just need to do is to let's go to the test here. Let me call it here, right? Add a subtract numbers. Let me have a variable called sum div, right? A variable called sum div, and then let me have a variable called subtract sub div. So equal to, so I will call that function, right? I'll call the function, okay, or let's pass in a value. Let's pass in a value. So what I just need to do, let me just copy this. Let me just copy this. So now remember the function, what we wrote here is add subtract numbers, right? So I'll just copy this and then paste it here. So add subtract numbers, and remember that we have two parameters, and so we are passing the arguments which are 10 and 5, which means that the a is assigned as 10 and the b is assigned as 5, right? So now we are using this print because when we're writing this function, there's no print, so we'll just return in states, and the return will not show it on the screen once we use print. But if there's a print within this function, we don't need to use print here, right? Don't need to use print. So let me remove this. Let's remove this. So what it does is, now when we say print the sum result here, right? So it returns the first one. It returns this first result, which is a plus b. Then the second one here returns the second result, which is a minus b. So if I'm to print this, you can see a plus b, which is 10 plus 5, which is 15, right? Then a minus b, which is 10 minus 5, will give you us what? 5. You can see what we did. We write a function that returns 2, right? Multiple, which is a plus b and a minus b. So let's try another thing. Let's try something like this. If you work a times b, right? So a times b, I just need to do here. Let's have another one called mult result, right? Like this. So if I'm to print mult result, you can see what happens, right? You can see the beauty of Python. So instead of me writing this in different places, I can just write a function like this, right? And then do all my stuff multiple like this. A plus b, I'm returning a minus b, I'll return a this, and then a divided by b. So if I run this, I can try to add more, maybe div result, right? So I can decide to print the div result, and then it gives me this, right? So even if I come here again and do A floor division B. So what this floor division does is you can see what this one you can see what this divided did. Well, it has 2.0, which is bringing out the float, the decimal number. So this A floor division B will exclude this decimal number here. So if I'm writing this, let me just put floor result. So if I'm to print this one, floor result. So you can see what will give me, give me the answer 2, right? It's excluding this floor division, excludes this decimal point and just give me the integer whole number, which is 2, right? So what if I do that? You can see you can do multiple multiplication within a function here, right? So Python allows you to do this, right? So it returns multiple results. Now that's the beauty of Python, right? So you've understood a single and you've understood multiple returns, right? So that is where we end this. Let's just look at the last one, which is lambda function. So lambda function are small anonymous function defined using the lambda keywords. Now they are typically used for short, simple operations, right? So this lambda function, right? So let's assume you can see what it does. So this is a lambda function. So when we pass in the argument 5 here, right? Remember this square. This is a variable name that holds this lambda function here. When passing 5, so it's just giving it like 5, right? So it's like the square of 5 will give you what 25. So if you pass into the square of 2, right, will give you what 4, right? So let's do this and see. So let's do this and see. So let me just put it here. So I have this, right? So even if I have, so if I'm to print this, it gives you 25 here, right? So if you put the 2 here, 2 will give you what? Then 2 will give you 4, 2 will give you 4, and so on and so forth. So that's what lambda function does, right? So it's just like a small function, right? An inbuilt function. So we have so many inbuilt functions here, which we're going to be using in these lectures. Like we have used the print, so we're going to be using the len, right? We're going to be explaining the len in our next lessons. We're going to be using some inbuilt functions in Python, so I get used to it. But one of the things I will prevent here is there are some functions we're going to be writing from scratch so that you can understand how the function, how you can understand how to write your own function, right? So we're going to be doing that in our next lesson. So thank you. We've understood functions here. We understood parameters. We understood the returns. We understood how to use print. We understood when to pass in values within a string data type, right? So everything is here, which I will share the slides on. I will share the slide on the Microsoft Teams. So thank you and God bless you.